Well, there are people in the world who are movers and shakers. Such people come to hold great influence over others as they drive forward, and their personality really forges ahead to make things happen. Saul of Tarsus was such a person. Highly motivated, deeply intelligent, preeminently qualified for his job. He was going around wreaking havoc among the early church as he persecuted followers of Christ, what they called followers of the way, those who believed in and served Jesus Christ. But maybe the saddest part of Saul's life was that he thought he was doing all of this for God. He thought that he was serving God by going around and wreaking havoc among the early church. But he wasn't serving God. So listen to Acts, as I read from Acts 9. But Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now as he went on his way, he approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven shone around him, and falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And he said, "Who are you, Lord?" And he said, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." At this moment, Saul's motivation didn't matter. And by that I mean his motivation of thinking he was serving God did not cleanse his actions against Christ and make them okay. He was mistakenly but fully fighting against God. He was serving his enslaving master, the prince of the power of the air, the ruler of the darkness of this world, Satan. In our current world of subjectivity, where objective truth is constantly under attack, many believe that a person's motivations are more important than the content of what they believe. Or to say that differently, truth takes the back seat as long as someone is sincere. We've followed Job's three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, through a number of speeches. We've seen them time and time again try to confront Job. They don't change in this process. They've stuck to their guns, and in this story, we would call them static characters. They don't change. You learn who they are, and you can depend on them to always act that way. Job, for his part, has tried to respond to these friends, and he has also at times tried to show them that there's a more important issue that he's trying to resolve, namely his relationship with God. Something, Job thinks, is wrong, and he's trying to find out what is wrong. In his final response to Bildad today, we'll see him ask a deeply penetrating question. In Job 26:4, he says, "With whose help have you uttered words, and whose breath has come out from you?" Here's the reason that I started with Saul of Tarsus, whom we know better now as Apostle Paul. He thought he was serving God, but in reality, he came to see that he was fighting against God. Job's three friends thought that they were counseling wisely and speaking rightly of God, but in reality, they were giving voice to the very temptations of whom? The temptations of Satan. While Job's three friends were static characters, they don't change throughout the series of debates. Job himself, we would call a dynamic character. He does change in the book. In fact, he changes to such a degree that some who have studied Job conclude that this part that we're about to read in Job, from Job 25 to 27, they think that it needs to be rearranged because surely Job didn't say some of these things. That's how much he changes in the book. Now, in some important ways, Job did not change. We'll see in chapter 27 that he continues to claim he's acted righteously and he's an innocent sufferer in this recent set of terrible losses that he's experienced. But now Job speaks of God's sovereignty, his control over the events of life, and specifically the punishment of the wicked. And he has changed, and he's changed for the better, I think we'll see. How's Job been able to weather the onslaught of his friends' attacks? How's he been able to cling to God through both the physical and mental suffering of loss, as well as the social suffering of having his friends repeatedly call him a wicked man? How has he survived this? Well, we'll see at least part of the answer in chapters 26 and 27 today. We can put that answer this way. Job chooses to obey God now, even though he does not understand God's plan in his life. To make this challenge directed towards us this morning, we could put it this way. Obey God now, understand his specific plan later. Obey God now, understand his specific plan later. And by that I mean his specific plan of what he's doing in your life right now. Do you always understand what God is trying to accomplish? No. Does God give us in his word what we need to go forward faithfully to him? Yes. Even if we don't have full understanding of what's going to happen, what's happening in our lives. Job is experiencing that in the book. Now, how can we summarize these chapters before we dig into them? Bildad's is blessedly short, thankfully, but we could summarize him this way. Man cannot be in the right before God. Job's reply to him is essentially this: your counsel has been worthless. God is indeed powerful, but who can understand what he is doing? Now, those summaries cover chapters 25 and 26. As we get to chapter 27, I think Job stops responding just to this friend Bildad and instead speaks to all three of his friends. His words to Bildad in chapter 26 were singular. The words you in verses 2 and 3 are masculine singular. He's just talking to Bildad. But by the time we get to chapter 27, he's talking to all three of them. So in verse 5, far be it from me to say that you are right. He uses the masculine plural. He's talking to multiple men here. So I've separated the summary of chapter 27, which I think is a more comprehensive and full answer from Job to the arguments of his three friends. And I've summarized it this way: God has made my soul bitter, but I hold fast my righteousness. The wicked cannot even call upon God, and we know the terrible end of the wicked, but I will still teach you what they suffer from God's hand. So you can find those summaries on the back of the handout in the bulletin if you want to refer to them again. But having said those things, let's now turn to Job 25 and read Bildad's third and final speech. Then Bildad the Shuhite answered and said, dominion and fear are with God. He makes peace in his high heaven. Is there any number to his armies? Upon whom does his light not arise? How then can man be in the right before God? How can he who is born of woman be pure? Behold, even the moon is not bright, and the stars are not pure in his eyes. How much less man, who is a maggot, and the son of man, who is a worm? Now, Bildad in some ways does improve. In his previous two speeches, he started with biting remarks, but this time maybe he's felt the sting of Job's replies, or maybe he's just more careful. But either way, he starts with God's character. Verse 2, dominion and fear are with God. His focus is on the greatness of God. And by fear, maybe more of an emphasis on terror, dominion and fear or terror are with him. As we've seen before, ancient wisdom that these men held to had a very exalted view of God. They had no problem seeing God's greatness in many ways, but it seemed to be at the expense of seeing God's desire to know his people. So God is high and above and in many ways unknowable. And their emphasis was on Job's need to appease God by living rightly. Since Bildad doesn't think that Job has lived rightly, then he needs to hear more about God's greatness. God makes peace in heaven. He commands innumerable armies and is the very one who gives light to all. And surely before this exalted God, no one can be right, so Bildad says. No single person is innocent before God. If the moon's brightness and the purity of the light from the stars do not even measure up to God's standards, then what person can? Man is like a maggot or worm before God. Can you imagine teaching that view of man? Okay, we're going to learn about people today. Step number 1, God views them as maggots. He's trying to get across the point, but it fails. Even though this speech is short, it doesn't take long to see the difficulty, once again, though, of discerning in these speeches what is right and helpful from what is skewed and wrong. What is wrong theology in what Bildad has to say? We should be humbled before God's greatness. His vastness and perfection and holiness should lay us low. And nobody is born. Nobody is born in innocence. Everyone is born as a sinner. Every person falls short of God's glory. We're to fear God and recognize that His dominion is above all. So what is wrong with his short speech? Well, Job is right before God. There is a way to be right before God, and it doesn't entail appeasing an unknowable God, making Him happy somehow so that life can be good. Bildad claims no one can be in the right before God, and that is mostly true. No one is born right before God. All fall short of His glory. But there is a way to be right before God. Perhaps Abraham is a good example to bring in at this time. It's been a while since we talked about the dating of this book, but Abraham probably lived before, maybe shortly before Job did. And Genesis 15:6 says of Abraham, and he believed the Lord, and He counted it to him as what? As righteousness. So Bildad, how can man be right before God? He can be right before God by faith. And Job believed in God. From start to finish in this story, he believes in God. While his friends throw out the possibility of Job's righteousness, we can't. He was a man who was blameless and upright. He feared God and he turned from evil. He is in the right before God. And so Bildad is wrong. Now, believer, let's say you're trying to help a friend understand more of God and the way of salvation, and you say very similar things to what Bildad says here. You try to help that person see that he or she is a sinner and guilty before God. That's an important truth that everyone must believe. We're naturally sinners and enemies before God. Bildad is wrong not because he believed those truths, but because he thought that God saw Job as a wicked man. He was wrong because he did not realize that by faith, Job had turned to God, and his life had been a life of integrity after that. What does Job have to say in response? Well, let's then look at chapter 26, starting in verse 1. Then Job answered and said, "How you have helped him who has no power. How you have saved the arm that has no strength. How you have counseled him who has no wisdom, and plentifully declared sound knowledge. With whose help have you uttered words, and whose breath has come out from you?" Now, if you didn't catch it, those first couple of verses are dripping with sarcasm. Verse 5, "The dead tremble under the waters and their inhabitants. Sheol is naked before God, and Abaddon has no covering. He stretches out the north over the void and hangs the earth on nothing. He binds up the waters in His thick clouds, and the cloud is not split open under them. He covers the face of the full moon and spreads over it His cloud. He has inscribed a circle on the face of the waters at the boundary between light and darkness. The pillars of heaven tremble and are astounded at His rebuke. By His power He stilled the sea. By His understanding He shattered Rahab. By His wind the heavens were made fair. By His hand pierced the fleeing serpent. Behold, these are but the outskirts of His ways, and how small a whisper do we hear of Him. But the thunder of His power, who can understand?" So Job does not spare sarcasm here, although Bildad apparently did. A friend should prove helpful, should save when possible, should counsel wisely, and should speak what is sound. But Bildad failed in every respect. Are there people in this world who want to help others? Yes, I believe so. Some people genuinely care about other people and will go to great lengths to help somebody in need. I'm very thankful for such people. For instance, the first responders in Monroe that we have here are a huge blessing that we have. Here are people that go towards dangerous situations while most of us run away from them. I was recently jogging along Elm, minding my own business, had my headphones in, and I hear this screech and bang up ahead of me. Well, that's not good. As I continue on my jog, I come up to this accident. Somebody had slowed down to take a left-hand turn, and the person behind them did not slow down in time, and so they rear-ended the car. As I came up to the accident, it didn't look very good. The car that had caused the accident was all scrunched in the front, smoke's coming out of it. The driver's still in there. Well, a Good Samaritan, I think maybe the first driver behind this, had already gotten out and was trying to get this lady out of the car. And here I come along on foot. And this Good Samaritan looks at me and quickly calls me over to help get this lady out. Now, I'd like to say that I care about other people, but at this moment, I have conflicting tensions in me. Some of you, accident happens, you're the first one to get there. And I will readily admit that I am not the first one to get there. Why? What's running through my head? What am I going to see when I open that door? So this Good Samaritan that's calling for my help is just totally baffled by my cautious approach. As I try to make my feet go towards this, she's waving me forward, trying to get the lady out. Now, we were able to get her to turn her ignition off. We forced the door open. We helped her off to the side of the road because we didn't know what was happening with that smoking car. But that was not my natural thing to do. There are those who rush towards those things looking to help, and I have a lot of respect for them. I have an inborn hesitancy and difficulty. There might be blood, and I'm not ready for it, and I'm not going to be ready for it. There's others who can handle that very well, and that's fantastic. But imagine a first responder appearing on that scene, approaching this lady, and attempting to put a tourniquet on her leg to keep her from going into shock. There's no visible blood. The leg is certainly not bleeding. We would say that's ludicrous. The first responder might be sincere, wanting to help, but the help would not be according to knowledge. And actually, that help would be quite dangerous. Here's the point. Bildad and the others might want to help, but they've been worthless. Maybe they were indeed the first friends on the scene, or maybe more accurately, they were the friends who were willing to mourn with Job and to sit with this disgusting-looking man and offer counsel. But that counsel was wrong, and it was unhelpful. So we see this incredibly perceptive question from Job. With whose help have you uttered words, and whose breath has come out from you? See, Satan wants to show that Job serves God for the goods. He's there to get rich again. He's there to have the easy life, the happy kids, the full house. Satan wants Job to serve God for those reasons. He wants him to make God happy with him so that he can live the good life. Or Satan would also be happy if Job cursed God to his face. But Satan doesn't talk to Job directly. We never see that in the book. He doesn't need to. Why? He has Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. 3 men close to Job who can feed him half-truths and cause God's servant to go astray and turn from God. There are plenty of people who will help you with the bigger questions of life. They might sound wise and sincere in their talk of humanity, of the world, of the universe, of the meaning of life, and of God. But you must ask, believer, as they raise their voices and do all they can to get your attention, do they speak the words of life? Because there are many who do not. Do they speak rightly of God? Do their plans for you honor God? Don't accept the lie that there is no longer absolute truth, right and wrong. Job recognized that these men were not from God. If they weren't from God, then whom were they from? There aren't many other options. They'd unknowingly become the voice of Satan. Words matter. Ideas matter. And so the second thing we could say of this passage, who can understand the sound of God's power? After asking that question in verse 4, Job then proceeds to draw attention to God's power. He's done this a couple times already in the book. You can see a couple references up there in Job 9 and Job 12, speaking of God's power. And here again in chapter 26, he speaks of God's power. The dead have cause to fear God, for Sheol, the realm of the dead, and Abaddon are open before him. Even death does not hide one from God. Then, as he goes on in the passage, have you ever been amazed that the earth just exists in the solar system? It just floats there in space? God hangs the earth on nothing. And those of you who are into science, you say, no, there's gravitational or some other type of pull. Yes, but it's God who made the solar system as it is. We don't see anything visibly holding up the world. We should be amazed that clouds can actually carry rain. And again, this is definitely beyond the limit of my understanding of science, but the language of verse 8 is pretty neat. He binds up the waters in his thick clouds, and the cloud is not split open under them. How is it that you have storm clouds carrying water and then water drops? God is the one who has designed that. Return to your childlike amazement. Be in wonder at the realities of creation. The world around us is no accident, and we can attribute it directly to God's power. When verse 11 talks about the pillars of heaven, again, use your imagination to see yourself standing before tall mountains on a clear day. See the big sky above you being held up by those pillars, by the mountains of heaven. But God can make those pillars shake merely by his rebuke. Already in Job 9:13, we came across the reference to Rahab, this monster of the past that God has defeated. We don't really know much about this monster, this evil being, and the point is that nothing can stand against God. He controls the sea and the wind. He pierces the fleeing serpent. Isaiah 27:1 speaks of the fleeing serpent and calls that serpent Leviathan. But again, there's not a whole lot I can give you about these creatures. The Bible just doesn't say much about them. And to summarize, Job says in verse 14, "Behold, these are but the outskirts of his ways, and how small a whisper do we hear of him." To a large extent, then, Job seems to be agreeing with Bildad. Yes, God's power is that none can match him. There is no being like God. He has no serious competitor. But the last line of verse 14, clearly sets Job apart from Bildad. What does he say there? But the thunder of his power, who can understand? I think one of the preeminent passages in the Bible on general revelation is in Romans 1. Romans 1, 18-20 plainly teach that God has shown his eternal power and divine nature to humanity through creation. And again, this is under attack too. There are those who are saying, no, we exist now because of evolution. Very different from what the Bible teaches. So we hold to Scripture teaching that God created the world. And as he created the world to show that he is an eternally powerful being. There is one such that exists. Creation bears witness to that. Verse 14 makes me think of Romans 1 and its teaching on general revelation of how God shows himself through creation. Creation bears witness to the Creator God, but creation does not give us propositional truth. It does not explicitly teach us who God is. Somebody cannot look at creation and learn how to be saved through Jesus Christ. But to come back to Job, I tend to think that Job's point here at the end of chapter 26 is that though God's power is clearly seen in creation, we do not through creation receive a specific instruction that helps us understand all of life. So you can't take a fishing trip and learn from that fishing trip what you should do about the next big important choice that you have. You can take a fishing trip and be reminded of God's greatness and God's power and rejoice in God's creation. But that fish or that river or that night in the woods is not going to suddenly reveal to you how to live your life. As he says, the thunder of his power, who can understand? He is saying, look, yes, God is powerful, but from creation, from what we see in the world around us, he still does not have a direct answer from God about the suffering that he's experiencing. And that is Job's quest. What is going on? Why has my life been devastated? So we go to Job chapter 27. Job's fuller answer to his friends. Verse 1, and Job again took up his discourse and said, as God lives, who has taken away my right, and the Almighty, who has made my soul bitter, as long as my breath is in me and the Spirit of God is in my nostrils, my lips will not speak falsehood, and my tongue will not utter deceit. Far be it from me to say that you are right. Till I die, I will not put away my integrity from me. I hold fast my righteousness and will not let it go. My heart does not reproach me for any of my days. Let my enemy be as the wicked, and let him who rises up against me as the unrighteous. For what is the hope of the godless when God cuts him off, when God takes away his life? Will God hear his cry when distress comes upon him? Will he take delight in the Almighty? Will he call upon God at all times? I will teach you concerning the hand of God. What is with the Almighty? I will not conceal. Behold, all of you have seen it for yourselves. Why then have you become altogether vain? This is the portion of a wicked man with God, and the heritage that oppressors receive from the Almighty. If his children are multiplied, it is for the sword, and his descendants have not enough bread. Those who survive him, the pestilence buries, and his widows do not weep. Though he heap up silver like dust and pile up clothing like clay, he may pile it up, but the righteous will wear it, and the innocent will divide the silver. He builds his house like a moth's, like a booth that a watchman makes. He goes to bed rich, but will do so no more. He opens his eyes, and his wealth is gone. Terrors overtake him like a flood. In the night, a whirlwind carries him off. The east wind lifts him up, and he is gone. It sweeps him out of his place. It hurls at him without pity. He flees from its power in headlong flight. It claps its hands at him and hisses at him from its place. The introduction to this speech is different than any other of Job's speeches in the book up to this time. This helps us see that the book is making a transition. No longer will the focus be on the debate between Job and his three friends. Job here offers a conclusion to the 3 rounds of the debate that began way back in Job 4, but what Job says here leads to responses both from Elihu, man we have not met yet, and from God himself. So to begin his conclusion to the debates, Job starts with an oath. I know that I am righteous before God. Here Job, in the form of a formal statement, and more specifically the form of an oath, declares that he has not spoken falsely or used deceit. But as he does so, he also makes accusations against God, and he gives voice formally to his complaints that God has taken away his rights to be heard and made his soul bitter. These words are incredibly significant in the book. Why do I say that? Well, both Elihu and God respond to what Job says here. Elihu says in Job 34, 2-5, hear my words, you wise men, and give ear to me, you who know. For the ear tests words as the palate tastes food. Let us choose what is right. Let us know among ourselves what is good. For Job has said, I am in the right, and God has taken away my right. And then more significantly, God answers Job when he says in chapter 40, verses 6-9, dress for action like a man, I will question you, and you make it known to me. Will you put me in the wrong? Will you condemn me that you may be in the right? Have you an arm like God? Can you thunder with a voice like his? So all that to say, Job with his words here in chapter 27 definitely gets the attention of Elihu and also causes God brings a response to what he has to say. But for now, back in chapter 27, he's begun to make a formal statement in the court session that he's really has wanted for many chapters. He's no guarantee that God will answer, but he goes forward anyway. And he says quite strongly that his words will be true in this court as he presents his case. He really leaves no doubt about the standard that he's going to hold himself to. In verse 5, he rejects the claim of his friends. Far be it from me to say that you are right. So he continues to hold out against them, saying that he's lived a life of integrity. Now, as the readers of the book of Job, we know that the case for him being a man of integrity is very strong. We saw that at the beginning of the book. This is how Job is repeatedly described there, as a man who, of course, I put myself on the spot and then I don't have it written down. How is it said there? Is a man that was blameless and upright, who feared God and turned away from evil. That's in verse 1 of the book. Very first verse. So the reader sees from the beginning that Job is a man who is truly God's servant. And he continues rejecting the claim of his friends. But Job's not done with his opening statements. He boldly maintains his righteousness when he says, in verse 6, I hold fast my righteousness and will not let it go. So I've mentioned already this morning Genesis 15:6, speaking of Abraham, and he believed the Lord and he counted it to him as righteousness. But speaking of Job, we don't know his whole life story, but we do know that he was a man of faith. He believed in the one true God, and his life bore witness to that. There's a careful distinction I want to draw here, though. The righteousness that Job claims, I believe, is shown in acts like leading his family to confession. We saw that in chapter 1. Leading them to worship the one true God. He had genuinely and faithfully served God and done nothing to warrant the severe suffering from God. He was an innocent sufferer. What he'd suffered was not a set of consequences for specific sins. He had lived a life of integrity as a God follower. This righteousness of Job was possible because of faith. It was a result of faith. But the righteousness talked about of Abraham in Genesis 15 was the future righteousness of Christ being put onto Abraham's account, so that he was no longer under condemnation before God, but was saved from sin as God declared him righteous. There is justification that happens at salvation, by which God declares one righteous who had previously been guilty before him. And there's also practical righteousness or integrity, whereby one lives rightly before God after believing in him. Which righteousness is Job claiming? He's claiming the righteousness of integrity, of living out practically in a way that honors God. And by doing so, he is standing in opposition to his friends. Then we have one more amazing statement from Job. End of verse 6. Did you catch this as we read through it? My heart does not reproach me for any of my days. Maybe you hear or read that statement and you say, really? That is possible? How could Job say that? Don't we all have regrets for choices we've made in the past? How is Job able to say this? Once again, I return to Job 1 and Job's lifestyle. Verses 4 and 5 in chapter 1 say this: his sons used to go and hold a feast in the house of each one on his day, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And when the days of feast had run their course, Job would send and consecrate them, and would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, it may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Thus Job did continually. Here's the wonderful truth. Job knew how to deal with sin. Job knew how to deal with sin. He knew how to confess before God, and he took very seriously both his personal need for right communion or fellowship with God and the need of his family for pursuing personal fellowship with God. He taught his family how to deal with sin, and he modeled it before them. Had Job made sinful choices in the past? Without a doubt, certainly. So how was he able to say that his heart did not reproach him for any of his days? He was able to say this because when he did come under conviction about his sin, he brought it to God. He dealt with it as God or another believer had apparently taught him to do. Do you know that's possible for us as well? It's possible for you to enjoy freedom from past sins as well. Hebrews 9, 13, and 14 teaches us this. I love this passage. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer sanctify for the purification of the flesh. That's very similar to what Job did. How much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish, purify our consciences from dead works to serve the living God? Through Christ, your conscience can be cleansed. That's what Job enjoyed. See, it's not that Job was perfect, and because of his perfection, his heart did not reproach him for any of his days. By no means. Job was a sinner like you and like me. But Job was able to rejoice in the forgiveness that God gave. He was able to live with a cleansed and purified conscience and serve the living God. So, believer, are you rejoicing in the clear conscience that God gives as a result of the sacrifice of Christ? Or are you trying to punish yourself for past sins and failing to live today as one who's been forgiven and cleansed by the blood of Christ? Rejoice in the shed blood of Christ. Rejoice in his sacrifice and the forgiveness and the cleansing that is through him. Or perhaps you have not yet put your trust in Christ for salvation from sin. You're here as an enemy still of God, and you know it. I call you to turn to Christ. He offered himself as an innocent sacrifice. He suffered God's wrath for the sins of his people so that God would forgive us and cleanse us from that sin. You can become one of God's own today by turning to Jesus and saying, Lord, I believe. And we call you to that. Do not let the opportunity pass by to turn to Christ. So let it not be a confusing thing that Job says, my heart does not reproach me for any of my days. Let it be a thing that causes us to rejoice. There is a way to live life with cleansed consciences and serve the living God. Job's an example of that. We go on to verses 7 to 10, but the wicked have no hope before him. Job now turns to his enemies, pronouncing an imprecatory statement or a curse on the one who rises up against him. He desires that his enemies be treated as the wicked and the unrighteous. This makes sense because, of course, Job is righteous, and any who oppose him, therefore, are wicked. Well, Job has made quite clear in his past speeches that he felt the sting of God's hand. Remember, we've tried to bring that out. The hand term. He has nonetheless continued pleading before God. It seemed as if God did not hear him. But he believes quite strongly that he has the right to approach God. For Job, praying to God is natural and part of life. He goes back and forth throughout his speeches of talking to his friends and then addressing God. Here's a man who prayed as a way of life. The wicked person, though, has no hope when God cuts him off. The communication between the wicked and God is non-existent. God does not hear that person's cry, meaning the wicked have no relationship with God to turn to. There's no fellowship there between the wicked and God. When distress enters the life of the wicked, that person cannot take delight in the Almighty nor call upon him. The wicked do not have any right to plead for God's action on their behalf, and Job makes that quite clear. But who are Job's enemies? Who's he identifying? His enemies must be his three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And I'll explain this more when we get to verse 11 shortly, but think of this one fact. In Job 3 through 27, we've seen speech after speech after speech. Job addresses or prays to God often. How many times do you think his friends prayed to God or addressed God in all of those chapters? Not once. Not one single time do we find his friends praying. They give no evidence of a personal relationship with God. None. So Job says, let my enemy know what it's like to be in distress and have no hope of calling upon God. He has had enough of his friends and their wisdom. So verses 11 to 23, God's hand will surely bring justice upon them. As Job says in verse 11, I will teach you concerning the hand of God. The you is plural. He's talking to his three friends. They have need of instruction here. They've wrongly accused him of being a wicked man. And he is calling for God to bring the judgment upon them that he thought they deserved. He's calling for God to bring the judgment upon them that they thought he deserved. So they thought he was a wicked man and should be judged. He's calling for God to bring that judgment upon them. Some have claimed that Job could not have said verses 13 through 23. It must be somebody else speaking. But I think this is one of the places that we see Job growing. Remember, he's a dynamic character in the story. He does change, and he changes for the better. So he proceeds through this statement and affirms that he does indeed believe God is just. If you've been listening to Job throughout the book, he really wrestles with this at times. But here he makes it clear. He believes God is just. The wicked answer for their wickedness. They are the ones who will experience terrors. They will see their wealth disappear. They will be beaten by the wind. God's world of order still stands. And those who oppose righteous people like Job will suffer at God's hand. And so we see Job clarifying what he believes, affirming God's justice, continuing to stand by faith before God. By way of conclusion, I've sought to make some applications throughout our time this morning, and I'm just going to end with this. Though Job did not know what God was doing in his life through his sufferings, he did know God. His friends, it seems, did not know God. Job's big view of God and his diligent pursuit of God and turning from sin meant that by God's grace he was ready for this period of intense suffering. He didn't think he was ready, but God knew. So though he didn't understand God's specific plan, he could continue following God in obedience, living a life of integrity to God's glory. So believers, let us be those who know our God, who are turning from our sin, and who are living lives of integrity. Let us always be pressing on to know our God. Let's pray. Thank you, Lord, for this example of Job, for this book, for the teaching here. How vital it is that whether we're enjoying days of blessing in this life or suffering from your hand, how vital it is that we seek you, that we know you, that we actively turn from sin and worship before you. Pray that you would encourage all of us in our walk with you today. Whatever is happening, however much we understand the life around us at this point, that we will be those who cling to your word, who rejoice in your truth, who walk before you because you have cleansed our consciences, and we can serve you, the living God. We pray in Jesus' name, amen.